The exploration ship Horizon dropped out of faster-than-light travel above a planet that should not exist according to every scientific model humanity had developed over 3 centuries of space exploration. The world below glowed with auroras that danced across both day and night sides, and massive creatures with wings soared through the upper atmosphere, leaving trails of light behind them like comets. Lieutenant Danny Hayes pressed his face against the observation window of the landing bay and watched those creatures circle lower as the Horizon entered orbit. They were huge even from this distance and moved with grace that seemed impossible for something so large. His heart pounded with excitement, mixed with fear because nothing in his training prepared him for first contact with a species that rode dragons through space. Captain Linda Morris stood behind him reviewing data on her tablet and frowning at readings that made no sense. The planet had medieval-level cities with castles and farms, but also energy signatures that suggested technology far beyond human capability. Radio signals in dozens of languages filled the communication channels, and some of those languages sounded almost musical, like singing rather than speech. "We go down in 2 hours," she said, and her voice was tight with tension. "Remember the mission parameters. We observe, we make peaceful contact, and we absolutely do not provoke anything that breathes fire and flies. Intelligence reports say the previous expedition disappeared without sending a distress call, and that was a military vessel with enough firepower to level a continent." Danny nodded but could not tear his eyes away from the dragons below. One of them was climbing toward the horizon, now moving faster than any aircraft humanity had ever built, and as it grew closer, he could see the rider on its back. She was tall and slender, with long silver hair that streamed behind her in the vacuum of space without any visible protection. "Suit. Captain, we have incoming." Morris barked into her communicator, and alarms started blaring throughout the ship. "All hands to stations. Unknown craft approaching at impossible speed." But Danny kept watching as the dragon and rider came alongside the horizon, matching their orbital velocity perfectly. The dragon was beautiful, with scales that shifted colors from deep blue to bright purple, and its tail was incredibly long and moved in patterns that seemed deliberate, like it was writing messages in empty space. The rider wore leather armor decorated with symbols that glowed faint gold, and she was smiling as she looked directly at the observation window where Danny stood. Their eyes met across the void, and Danny felt something shift in his chest, like recognition, even though he had never seen her before. She raised one hand in greeting, and then the dragon banked away, diving back toward the planet's surface with speed that should have torn them both. Apart from acceleration forces, the landing party consisted of 6 humans, including Danny and Captain Morris, along with 2 security officers and a diplomatic specialist named Claire Watson, who had studied every known alien culture humanity had encountered. They took a shuttle down to coordinates provided by someone on the planet's surface, though the message had been in perfect English, which seemed impossible. The landing site was a meadow surrounded by forest, with mountains rising in the distance, and waiting for them was a camp of large leather tents arranged in a circle around a central fire. Dozens of dragons rested around the camp, some small as horses, others massive as buildings, and among them walked tall figures with pointed ears and eyes that reflected light like cats. The shuttle touched down gently, and the boarding ramp extended with a hiss of hydraulics. Captain Morris took a deep breath and led the team out into alien air that smelled of flowers and smoke and something wild that made Danny's instincts scream both danger and wonder. A delegation of 5 elves approached, and the one in front was the woman Danny had seen in space. She was even more striking up close, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with silver eyes and an expression of amused curiosity. Behind her walked her dragon, moving with surprising quiet, despite its enormous size, and its tail swayed in those same deliberate patterns Danny had noticed before. "Welcome, humans," she said in flawless English with an accent that sounded like water over stones. "I am Lyra of the Sylvani people, and this is my companion Stormwing. We have been expecting you, though, perhaps not so soon after the last of your kind came to take what was not theirs to take, Captain." Morris stepped forward with her hands visible and empty in the universal gesture of peace. "We come to establish friendly relations and to learn about your people. We mean no harm and seek only understanding." Lyra smiled, and it was not entirely friendly. "The last humans who came here said similar words before they tried to steal dragon eggs from our nesting grounds. 12 of your people died that day, and 300 of our dragons were injured defending their young. So forgive me if I question the sincerity of human promises. The tension was thick enough to cut, and Danny saw the security officers subtly adjust their positions ready to draw weapons if needed. But Lyra was watching him, not the captain, and her silver eyes seemed to see through his uniform straight into his thoughts. "You," she said, and pointed at Danny. "You are different from the others. Come with me." Before anyone could react, she crossed the distance between them in 3 long steps and grabbed Danny's wrist with fingers that were surprisingly warm and incredibly strong. She pulled him toward her tent, and Stormwing followed, with heavy footsteps that shook the ground, and Danny had just enough time to see Captain Morris's shocked expression before he was dragged through the tent flap into dimness that smelled of leather and dragon and something sweet like incense. Lyra released his wrist and turned to face him with that same amused smile, and behind her, Stormwing coiled onto a pile of furs and fixed Danny with eyes that glowed like embers. The dragon's tail continued its patterns, and now that he was close, Danny could see the scales at the tip flickered with bioluminescent light. "She dragged me into her tent," Danny thought wildly, and his training screamed at him to be cautious, to follow protocols, to not let himself be separated from his team. But something deeper than training told him this was important, that this moment would change everything. "You really like tails, huh?" Lyra said, and her smile widened as she settled onto a cushion and gestured for him to sit. Danny sat down slowly on the cushion across from Lyra, while keeping his eyes on Stormwing, whose massive head now rested on her shoulder like an affectionate cat. The dragon's tail continued its hypnotic movements, and Danny realized he had indeed been staring at the tails of every dragon he saw since landing. There was something about the way they moved that fascinated him, like they were communicating in a language he almost understood. "How did you know?" Danny asked, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. "About the tails, I mean." Lyra reached up and stroked Stormwing's scales, and the dragon made a sound like a giant cat purring. "I have been watching your ship since it entered our system. Stormwing and I flew up to see what kind of humans you were, and through the window I saw you. While your captain worried about weapons and your security team checked their equipment, you watched the dragons with wonder. You noticed their tails first before their size or their fire or their teeth." She leaned forward, and her silver eyes caught the light from the bioluminescent scales on Stormwing's tail. "That told me something important about you, that you see beauty before you see danger, that you want to understand before you want to control. These are rare qualities in humans based on what we learned from your previous visit." Danny thought about the classified reports he had glimpsed before the mission. The previous expedition had been military-focused, with orders to acquire dragon specimens for research and potential weapons development. It made him sick to think about treating these magnificent creatures as tools or weapons. What happened to them, Danny asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "To the last humans who came here." Lyra's expression hardened, and Stormwing lifted his head with a low growl that Danny felt in his bones. "They came with smiles and promises of friendship, just like you. But at night they sent soldiers to the nesting grounds with nets and tranquilizer weapons. They thought we would not notice or that we could not stop them." She stood and walked to the tent flap, pulling it aside slightly so Danny could see outside, where dozens of dragons rested peacefully. "The Sylvani are not warriors by nature. We are scholars and artists and explorers. But our dragons are family, not pets or property. When your people attacked the nests, every Sylvani within 100 miles felt the distress calls through our bonds." "What did you do?" Danny asked, though he already knew this story would not end well for the humans. Lyra let the tent flap fall closed and turned back to face him. Stormwing and 300 of his kin took to the skies. "Your people had powerful weapons, but they had never fought enemies who could fly faster than sound and breathe fire hot enough to melt steel. The battle lasted less than an hour. We gave them one chance to surrender and retreat to their ship. Some did, and we let them go. Others kept fighting, kept trying to steal eggs, even as dragons burned their weapons and armor." "How many survived?" Danny asked quietly. 43 out of 212, Lyra said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, only sadness. "We sent them home with a message that any future attempts at theft would result in the complete destruction of their vessels before they reached orbit. Your government received that message clearly because it took 60 years before another human ship approached our world." Danny felt shame burning in his chest, even though he had not been part of that expedition, had not even been born when it happened. But they were his people, his species, and their actions had created this wall of distrust. "I am sorry," he said, and meant it with everything in him. "What they did was wrong. Dragons are not things to be taken or owned. Anyone who treats them that way deserves what happened. Lyra studied him for a long moment, and then something in her expression softened. That is why I brought you here, Danny Hayes. Because I needed to know if any humans understood this truth, or if your entire species was blind to it. She sat back down and gestured to Stormwing, whose tail swept across the floor before rising up to examine Danny more closely. The tip of the tail with its glowing scales moved within inches of his face, and Danny forced himself to remain still, even though his heart hammered against his ribs. Dragons are not like human animals, Lyra explained. They are as intelligent as we are, perhaps more so in ways we do not fully understand. Each dragon chooses a companion among the Sylvani when they are young. This choice cannot be forced or bought or manipulated. It simply happens when dragon and elf recognize something in each other. The tail touched Danny's cheek gently, and warmth flooded through him, not just physical heat, but something deeper. Images flashed through his mind. He saw Lyra as a child running through a forest and a dragon hatchling no bigger than a dog chasing after her on clumsy legs. He felt the joy of their first flight together, and the terror when Lyra fell from a cliff and Stormwing caught her mid-air. He experienced the bond between them as real and solid as any physical thing. When the vision faded, Danny found tears running down his face, and Stormwing had wrapped the tip of his tail gently around Danny's wrist like a handshake. He showed you, Lyra said with wonder in her voice. Stormwing showed you our bond. He has never done that with anyone outside our family. Danny wiped his eyes with his free hand, embarrassed by the tears but unable to stop them. I felt it. I felt everything. How can anyone experience that and still think dragons could be property? They cannot, Lyra said simply. That is why your previous expedition failed so catastrophically. They thought dragons were animals to be tamed. They could not conceive that dragons might be equals or even superiors. Stormwing released Danny's wrist and curled back onto his pile of furs, but his eyes remained fixed on the human, with an expression that might have been approval. Your captain wants an alliance, Lyra said. She wants access to our technology and perhaps still hopes to acquire dragons, though she is smart enough not to say so directly. What do you want, Danny Hayes? Danny thought about that question carefully because he sensed his answer would determine whether humanity got a second chance with the Sylvani or was sent away forever. Danny took a deep breath and met Lyra's silver eyes directly. I want to understand. Not to use or exploit, but to genuinely understand. What you have with Stormwing is the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed, and if humanity could learn to respect that, to honor it, maybe we could become something better than we are. Lyra tilted her head, studying him like she was reading words written across his soul. And if I told you that understanding comes with a price, that to truly comprehend the bond between Sylvani and dragon, you would have to open yourself completely, would you still want it? Yes, Danny said without hesitation, and surprised himself with his certainty. Whatever it takes. Stormwing made a sound like wind chimes, and his tail began moving in new patterns that seemed almost excited. Lyra smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, transforming her face from merely beautiful to radiant. Then we will teach you, she said. But first you must convince your captain that humanity needs to approach us with humility, not ambition. Can you do that? Danny thought about Captain Morris, who was pragmatic and mission-focused, but also fair and willing to listen. I can try. She trusts my judgment, even if she does not always agree with me. Lyra stood and offered her hand to help Danny up. Her grip was firm and warm, and when she pulled him to his feet, he realized again how much taller and stronger she was than any human. Come. We should return before your security team decides to attempt a rescue. That would end badly for everyone. They emerged from the tent into late afternoon sunlight that turned the scales of surrounding dragons into a dazzling display of colors. Captain Morris stood with the diplomatic team, looking tense but relieved when she saw Danny unharmed. The two security officers had their hands near their weapons, but Lyra ignored them completely. Your lieutenant and I have had an interesting conversation, Lyra announced to the group. He has convinced me that perhaps not all humans are as foolish as those who came before. I am willing to discuss an alliance, but the terms will be different from what you expect. Captain Morris straightened, and her expression shifted into diplomatic mode. We are prepared to negotiate in good faith. What terms do you propose? Lyra gestured, and other Sylvani emerged from tents, forming a semicircle around the humans. Each had a dragon companion, and Danny noticed the tails of every dragon were moving in synchronized patterns like they were all part of the same conversation. First, Lyra said you must understand what you are asking, for when you request access to our technology, the Silvani did not invent our way of traveling between stars. The dragons taught us. Every advancement we have made came from our partnership with them. Without dragons, we would still be farming with wooden plows. She walked to Stormwing and placed her hand on his massive shoulder. Dragons perceive the universe differently than we do. They see connections and pathways that even our most advanced sensors cannot detect. They navigate space by instinct and carry us with them through their understanding of reality that transcends our physics. Captain Morris frowned, trying to process this information. So your technology is biological, not mechanical? Lyra shook her head. It is both and neither. It is cooperation between two species who each bring unique strengths. Alone, the Silvani are creative but limited. Alone, the dragons are powerful but lack precision. Together, we become something greater than the sum of our parts. One of the other Silvani stepped forward, an older male with white hair and eyes that held deep wisdom. I am Elder Kieran, and I witnessed the attack by your previous expedition. I watched humans try to cage lightning and wondered at the arrogance. Now I wonder if this new group understands why such attempts must fail. Danny spoke up before Captain Morris could respond. We are starting to understand, sir. You cannot separate the Silvani from their dragons because you are one civilization, not two. Trying to take dragons without Silvani partners would be like trying to use a human brain without a body. Kieran's eyebrows rose and he exchanged glances with Lyra. This one learns quickly. Perhaps there is hope. Captain Morris looked at Danny with an expression he could not quite read. Lieutenant Hayes, perhaps you should explain what you learned in that tent. Danny gathered his thoughts, knowing this moment was crucial. The Silvani and dragons share a bond that goes deeper than training or domestication. It is a true partnership where both sides contribute equally. When Stormwing showed me his connection with Lyra, I felt it. I felt their shared experiences and emotions. Trying to acquire dragons without that bond would give us nothing but dangerous animals with no loyalty or cooperation. He turned to face Lyra directly. If humanity wants an alliance with the Silvani, it cannot be based on taking or trading. It has to be built on genuine friendship and mutual respect. And maybe centuries from now, if we prove ourselves worthy, some dragons might choose human companions. But that choice has to be theirs, not ours. The clearing fell silent except for the rustle of dragon wings and the whisper of wind through trees. Lyra looked at Elder Kieran, who nodded slowly. Then she looked at the other Silvani, who seemed to be communicating through glances and subtle gestures. Finally, Lyra stepped forward and extended her hand to Captain Morris in the human style of greeting. On behalf of the Silvani, I accept the possibility of alliance. But it will be a long process. You must send people to live among us to learn our ways and let us learn yours. There will be no exchange of technology until both sides trust each other completely. Captain Morris shook Lyra's hand firmly. Those terms are acceptable. How long do you anticipate this process taking? Lyra smiled. For your previous group, it would have taken forever because they came with greed in their hearts. For this group, perhaps only a few years if you continue to show the wisdom your lieutenant demonstrated today. She turned to Danny and her smile widened. In fact, I propose that Lieutenant Hayes be the first human to remain with us. He has already begun to understand the bond, and Stormwing has shown unprecedented interest in him. With proper training, he might become the bridge between our peoples. Danny's heart leapt at the possibility even as his mind raced with the implications. Captain Morris raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the suggestion. Lieutenant, she said, would you be willing to accept this assignment? Danny looked at Stormwing, whose tail was moving in patterns that somehow felt encouraging. He looked at Lyra, whose silver eyes held a challenge and a promise. He thought about everything he had felt in that tent and knew there was only one answer he could give. Yes, Captain, he said. I would be honored. The first week living among the Silvani taught Danny more about humility than his entire military career. He woke before dawn each morning because the dragons woke before dawn, and their movements shook the ground enough to rattle his bones. He learned to cook over open fires because the Silvani preferred the taste of flame-cooked food over anything produced by technology. He struggled to understand a language that seemed to shift depending on whether you were speaking to an elf or a dragon or both at once. Lyra was his primary teacher, and she showed no mercy for his human limitations. When he complained about the cold mountain air, She told him dragons preferred high altitudes, and if he wanted to understand them, he needed to become comfortable in their environment. When he struggled to climb the steep trails, she reminded him that Sylvani children made this journey easily, and perhaps humans were not as adaptable as they claimed. But she also showed unexpected kindness. On the third night, when Danny sat alone missing his crewmates and questioning his decision, Lyra brought him tea made from mountain herbs and sat with him in companionable silence. Stormwing curled around them, both providing warmth and a sense of security that eased Danny's homesickness. "You are doing well," she said finally. "Better than I expected, honestly. Most humans would have demanded to return to their ship by now." Danny sipped the tea, which tasted like flowers and smoke. "I made a commitment. Besides, every day here I see things that make going back feel impossible. How can I return to a normal life after experiencing what you have shown me?" Lyra smiled, and Stormwing's tail draped across Danny's shoulders like a friendly arm. "That is the danger of understanding. Once you truly see something beautiful, you can never unsee it. Once you know what connection really means, you can never be satisfied with isolation." Over the following weeks, Danny began to notice patterns he had missed initially. The way dragons and Sylvani moved in harmony without speaking. How a dragon's tail positions communicated complex ideas faster than words. The subtle songs that dragons hummed that affected the emotions of everyone nearby. He started recognizing individual dragons by their scale patterns and personality quirks, and realized they were as different from each other as humans were. Stormwing took particular interest in Danny's education. The great dragon would appear whenever Danny struggled with a lesson, offering wordless encouragement through tail gestures and gentle nudges. Once, when Danny attempted to learn the tail language and failed miserably, Stormwing wrapped his tail around Danny's waist and lifted him into the air. The sudden flight terrified and exhilarated Danny in equal measure, and when they landed, he understood the lesson. Communication was not just about signals, but about trust. Lyra noticed the growing bond between Danny and Stormwing. She said nothing about it directly, but Danny caught her watching them with an expression that mixed hope with concern. One evening, after a particularly successful day of lessons, she invited Danny to join her for a flight. "Stormwing can carry both of us," she explained as she checked the leather harness that allowed riders to stay secure during flight. "I want to show you something that few humans have ever seen." Danny climbed onto Stormwing's back behind Lyra and gripped the harness with white knuckles. The dragon launched into the air with powerful beats of his wings, and Danny's stomach dropped as the ground fell away. They climbed higher than he thought possible until the air grew thin, and cold and stars appeared despite the sun still being visible on the horizon. "Look," down Lyra called over the wind and pointed to the planet below. Danny looked and gasped. From this height he could see patterns of light connecting every Sylvani settlement. The lights pulsed in rhythm like a heartbeat, and he realized he was seeing the bonds between dragons and their companions made visible through some property of the upper atmosphere. "This is what we protect," Lyra said, and her voice carried clearly despite the wind. "This is why we could never let your people take dragons. Every light you see represents a connection that took years to form. Breaking even one would be like tearing out someone's heart." Danny understood then the true weight of what the previous expedition had attempted. They had not just tried to steal animals, but to sever bonds that were as real and vital as any organ. "How do the bonds form?" he asked. "How do dragons choose their companions?" Lyra was quiet for a moment as Stormwing glided in wide circles. "We do not fully understand it ourselves. When a dragon hatches, they sense the Sylvani around them. Sometimes they choose immediately, sometimes they wait years. But when the choice happens, both dragon and elf feel it like a key turning in a lock. Everything suddenly makes sense in a way it never did before." "Has a dragon ever chosen a non-Sylvani?" Danny asked and held his breath, waiting for the answer. Lyra turned to look at him, and in the thin atmosphere her eyes seemed to glow brighter. "Not in recorded history, but the ancient texts suggest it happened once long ago, when the Sylvani were still learning what it meant to live alongside dragons. A wanderer from a distant land earned the trust of a young dragon, and together they became legends." She turned back to face forward. "Why do you ask Danny Hayes? Do you hope Stormwing might choose you?" Danny thought carefully about his answer. "I do not hope for it because I know I have not earned it. But I would be lying if I said the possibility did not make my heart race. What I have seen here changed me. I cannot imagine going back to a life where this depth of connection does not exist." Stormwing made a sound like distant thunder, and his tail curled up to brush against Danny's leg. Lyra laughed, and it sounded like music. My companion says you are honest, and honesty is rare enough to be precious. He also says you have potential, but potential means nothing without patience and dedication. I have time, Danny said. However long it takes, I will stay and learn. They flew for hours, showing Danny the vast territories where Sylvani and dragons lived in harmony. He saw crystal cities built into mountainsides where light reflected through dragon-made glass. He saw training grounds where young Sylvani learned to fly and young dragons learned to carry riders. He saw nesting grounds protected by ancient magic and technology working together to ensure eggs could hatch safely. When they finally returned to Camp, Danny's legs shook as he dismounted and his head spun from the thin air at high altitude. But his spirit soared with possibilities he had never imagined. Lyra helped steady him and smiled at his obvious exhaustion. You did well for your first real flight. Most humans would have passed out from fear or altitude sickness. I almost did both, Danny admitted. But I did not want to miss a single moment. Stormwing nudged Danny with his massive head, nearly knocking him over, and the dragon's tail wrote symbols in the air that Danny was starting to recognize as approval. 3 months passed, and Danny barely recognized the person he had become. His hands were calloused from climbing, and his skin was bronze from constant sun exposure at high altitudes. He spoke Sylvani fluently now and could read basic tail language, though the more complex symbols still eluded him. Most importantly, he had stopped thinking of himself as an outsider observing an alien culture and started feeling like he belonged. Captain Morris visited twice, bringing supplies and updates from the horizon. She seemed pleased with his progress and the diplomatic reports he sent back. The alliance between humanity and the Sylvani was growing stronger, largely because Danny served as living proof that humans could adapt and respect their ways, but something was changing that Danny did not fully understand. Stormwing had become his constant companion, spending more time with Danny than with Lyra. At first, Lyra seemed amused by this, but lately Danny noticed worry in her silver eyes. Other Sylvani watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern, and Elder Kieran had started joining their lessons, asking questions that felt like tests. One morning, Danny woke to find Stormwing sleeping outside his tent, which had never happened before. Dragons always slept near their chosen companions, and Lyra's tent was on the opposite side of camp. Danny emerged into the pre-dawn darkness and placed his hand on Stormwing's scales. The dragon's eyes opened immediately, glowing soft purple in the darkness. "What are you doing here?" Danny whispered. "You should be with Lyra." Stormwing's tail rose and began writing symbols that Danny had learned meant choice and change and new beginning. His heart started pounding because he understood what those symbols suggested, but could not believe it was possible. Lyra appeared from the shadows, moving silently despite her height. Her expression was complicated, mixing joy with sadness and something that might have been pride. "He has chosen," she said simply. "After all these years of being bonded to me, Stormwing has found another who calls to him more strongly. I did not think it was possible, but dragons are full of surprises." Danny felt panic rising in his chest. "No, that cannot be right. You and Stormwing have been together since childhood. I would never try to come between you." Lyra stepped closer and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You did not try, Danny. You simply were yourself, and somehow that was enough. Stormwing loves me and always will, but what he feels for you is different. It is the choosing bond, the one that defines a dragon's life. But you," Danny protested. "What happens to your bond with him? It remains," Lyra said with a sad smile. "But it changes. I will always be his first companion, his childhood friend. But you will be his true partner if you accept." The ancient text spoke of this. Dragons can love many, but can only truly bond with one. Tears ran down Danny's face without permission. "I cannot take him from you. It would be wrong." Stormwing made a sound like a landslide, and his tail wrapped around both Danny and Lyra, pulling them together. Images flooded Danny's mind. He saw Lyra as Stormwing saw her, beloved sister, cherished friend, but not the one. Then he saw himself through Stormwing's eyes, and the feelings were different, deeper, more complete, like two pieces of a puzzle finally matching. When the vision faded, Lyra was crying too, but she was also smiling. "This is not loss, Danny. This is transformation. Stormwing and I will always be family, but now he has found his destiny, and I am happy for him, for both of you." Elder Kieran appeared with several other Sylvani, and Danny realized this moment had been anticipated by more than just Lyra. The old elf looked at Danny with new respect. In 300 years, no outsider has ever been chosen by a dragon. The ancient legend suggested it was possible, but we thought they were just stories. You have done something remarkable, Danny Hayes. You have proven that the bond transcends species and culture. You have shown that what matters is not what you are, but who you are. The other Sylvani began singing in their musical language, and dragons across the camp joined in with harmonious rumbles. Stormwing's tail tightened around Danny in what felt like an embrace, and suddenly Danny felt it, the bond snapping into place like Lyra had described. A key turning in a lock, everything making sense in a way it never had before. He gasped as Stormwing's thoughts merged with his own. Not words, but pure understanding. He felt the dragon's joy at finally finding his true companion. He felt Stormwing's love for Lyra unchanged, but transformed into something familial rather than primary. He felt the weight of responsibility that came with being chosen, and the incredible privilege of being deemed worthy. Lyra stepped back, giving them space, and wiped her tears. The ceremony must be completed at dawn. Danny Hayes, you must declare your acceptance before the council, and Stormwing must mark you as his own. Are you prepared for this? Danny looked into Stormwing's glowing eyes and felt the bond thrumming between them like a living thing. He thought about everything he had learned over the past months, about respect and patience and the willingness to change, about leaving behind everything familiar for something greater. I am prepared, he said, and his voice did not shake. The ceremony took place as the sun rose over the mountains. Every Sylvanian dragon in the settlement gathered in the central clearing. Captain Morris and a delegation from the horizon had been summoned and stood watching with expressions of awe. Elder Kieran led the ritual, speaking in ancient words that predated even the Sylvani's alliance with dragons. Danny knelt before Stormwing as instructed. The great dragon lowered his head until their foreheads touched, and Danny felt fire flowing through his veins, not painful, but transformative. When Stormwing pulled back, Danny knew something fundamental had changed. He could feel the dragon's presence in his mind, always there like a second heartbeat. Stormwing's tail rose, and the tip, glowing with bioluminescence, touched Danny's chest, directly over his heart. The scales there pressed down firmly, and when they pulled away, they left a mark. A shimmering pattern that looked like dragon scales imprinted on Danny's skin. Rise, Danny, Stormwing, Elder Kieran said, using the traditional bonded name. You are no longer merely human nor merely Sylvani. You are dragon bonded, the first of your kind. May you serve as a bridge between our peoples and proof that understanding transcends all boundaries. Danny stood and looked at Lyra, who was crying openly now, but smiling through her tears. Thank you, he said, for trusting me, for teaching me, for letting him go. I did not let him go, Lyra said. I let him grow. There is a difference. Stormwing launched into the air with a roar that shook the mountains, and Danny felt the dragon's joy as his own. Without conscious thought, Danny raised his arms, and Stormwing swept down, grabbing him gently in his claws. Together they soared into the morning sky, and Danny laughed with pure exhilaration as the world fell away beneath them. Below, Captain Morris stood with her mouth open in shock. The rest of the human delegation looked equally stunned. But the Sylvani sang their approval, and other dragons took flight, joining Stormwing in an aerial display that painted the sky with color. Danny looked down at the settlement where two civilizations were learning to trust each other. He thought about the long road ahead and the responsibility he now carried as the bridge between worlds. But mostly he felt the bond thrumming between himself and Stormwing, and knew with absolute certainty that he had found his purpose. The dragon who had shown him the meaning of true connection had chosen him, and Danny would spend the rest of his life proving worthy of that choice.